Hey everyone, good afternoon. Happy Friday. I'm Briana, she, her pronouns, and I am the executive director at Healthy and Free Tennessee, an organization working to grow the movement for reproductive justice across race, class, and gender. And we work to dismantle harmful systems of oppression while also using creativity and innovation to really build the systems and relationships that we need in order for communities to thrive and to really work towards self and community determination. So I'm so excited today. This is our next installment in our In Bloom series. We'll be diving into intersectionality and a family policing system and really discussing how race, disability, gender, immigration status shape families' experiences with the family policing system and how these oppressions really converge and really shape how people are able to navigate and are able to parent and really raise children and their families in safe, sustainable, and thriving communities. So we're really excited about the panel of folks today who are going to be talking about their experiences and really uplifting an aspect of these different oppressions and again how they really converge with the family policing system and the experiences within the family policing system. So I'm going to pass it now to Toniah Anderson, Healthy and Free's campaign strategist, to talk more about our work with the family policing system and our campaign that we launched this year.
Thank you, Brianna. As Brianna stated, I am Toniah Anderson. I also go by Naya, she, her pronouns, and I am the campaign strategist for Healthy and Free Tennessee. And so I've been mostly focused on our Poverty Stop Neglect campaign, which is our campaign we started this year to clarify in Tennessee law that poverty should not constitute neglect, and that just because parents are poor doesn't mean they deserve to have their children taken away from them. So, as far as our campaign, good news, we got our bill passed. It passed the House and the Senate, and it was signed into law by Governor Bill Lee. So, it will be going into effect on July 1st as Public Chapter 322. So that's good news about that. So we're really focused on implementation and education right now surrounding the campaign. And so I also want to take a second to uplift and acknowledge June as Stolen Children's Month. So, Stolen Children's Month is a time to uplift the voices of stolen children and their families. And to also shift the narrative towards ending family separation by abolishing systems of family separation, family policing, youth incarceration, and immigrant detention and deportation. So I'm going to pass it back over to Brianna to talk a little bit about our conversation tonight, which is about intersectionality and family policing. So she's going to define intersectionality a little bit for us and talk about it in the context of family policing.
Thank you, Naya. I'm happy to really ground this conversation in intersectionality and dig into what that framework is, but also going a little bit back before intersectionality was coined. And so intersectionality has become very popular nowadays, and I want to just kind of highlight some key aspects of the framework. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s, and it's a legal power-based framework. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a lawyer, a legal scholar, developed this framework to really examine and uplift the ways that Black women experience discrimination within a legal context or under U.S. law. And at the time, when she was thinking about what was going on, what she was seeing as a lawyer, she saw that within the law, gender and racial discrimination were viewed separately. And so for Kimberly Crenshaw, she was like, it's not just race over here and gender over here. And when she was thinking about Black women and other women of color specifically, it was like these things are happening simultaneously and they are interlocking, they're intersecting to compound the experiences that different folks face. And so, one case that she lifted up was these Black women who weren't able to receive promotions at General Motors. And it was because they were Black women, race and gender, not just like because they were Black or because they were women. So, that is one thing I want to lift up, but also really. Want to highlight how it is a legal framework. And even though it has really taken a different shape in what we see today and what we see in the media, that it is important that it was really thinking about the context of like laws. And from that, or kind of as other ways that other people, other Black feminists have thought about this, I really want to highlight that. And so this like idea of oppressions intersecting, interlocking forms of oppression is something that Black feminists for generations have really talked about, examined. And in the 20th century, mid 20th century, it was really thought of as triple oppression or triple exploitation. And these Black women were really uplifting this interlocking system of race, gender, and class-based oppression. And there's a group, the Combahee River Collective, a Black feminist group who also like uplifted that as well and really pointed out these interlocking forms of oppression. And again, it's not they were really clear that you can't like tease out these things. So again, it's not race over here, gender over there, and class over on beyond, but how these systems really work together and how they reinforce each other. So when we consider racism, capitalism, and patriarchy, they're deeply intertwined and are deeply connected to each other. And it's not like additive, it's how it's multiplicative and really exacerbate how people navigate the world. And so I just want to like really stress this framework, intersectionality as a framework and a legal framework, and also this concept of triple oppression and interlocking forms of oppression that have existed, that thinking has existed for some time, that predates intersectionality. And again, it being an analysis around power, a framework around power, a theory around power, and not about identities. I know sometimes that has been uplifted, like, oh, I'm a teacher, I'm a painter, et cetera, et cetera. But it really is like how power, how different systems of oppression really compound and shape our lives. It's how they shape our conditions. And so when we think about the family policing system and the oppressions that are really coming together and converging and how they reinforce each other, there are a few things I want to uplift. And I know that the panelists today are going to really expound on this. So one piece, as we think about class and poverty, over 85% of families investigated for child neglect earn less than 200,000 of the poverty line. And referrals are heavily concentrated among those who are on public assistance or who are living in impoverished neighborhoods. And when we consider race, or again, like how these things are intersecting, they're interlocking, we know that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx families are disproportionately targeted by the child welfare or family policing system nationwide and also in Tennessee. And this was also highlighted with the onset of the pandemic and people trying to push investigations because families were, like not wanting to send their children back to schools, and data that had been out there but was uplifted how Black families, Black children are disproportionately impacted by DCS investigations, and close to 50% of Black children will like face the family policing system. So that's something to lift up, especially as we think about the population, the representation of Black people in society. And again, thinking about that statistic of 50% when it comes to DCS investigations. As we think about gender, we know that mothers, especially single mothers, are most often blamed for poverty and face heightened surveillance. And this comes into play too with like conversations around housing, which is one way that families are separated, and how mothers, how women are disproportionately impacted because of class, with not having adequate housing, and how this puts them in a position of being disproportionately impacted by investigations when it comes to child welfare as well. And one other piece that we want to highlight that is key is around disability and ability. So parents and caregivers with disabilities are more likely to be reported and lose custody, not because of harm, but because of these ableist assumptions about their capacity to parent. So with this, really coming down to like who gets to be a parent, or with all of these aspects as they converge and really exacerbate people's experiences with the child welfare system, family policing system, and who is more likely to come into contact with the family policing system and face an investigation. These pieces are critical. And again, with disability, just like, oh, if you have a disability, you shouldn't be a parent. And today we're going to talk about sexuality and how that's a deep connection as well. So I will stop right here, pass it back to Toniah, but really wanted to lay this groundwork around how these oppressions are converging to shape people's lived experiences, their material conditions when it comes to navigating the family policing system.
Thank you so much for getting us grounded in this conversation, Briana. So first up, we're going to have Shawneequa Shepard, and they are going to speak on Black families and family policing. So Shawneequa, can you start by introducing yourself and describing your relationship to the topic, Black families and family policing?
Hello, everybody. My name is Shawneequa Shepard. I am a mother of three children. I'm a grandmother of one. And my relationship to Black families and the family policing system is I'm a parent who survived the family policing system by being system impacted and also being an abuse survivor. And so now I am a family advocate for other people that are going through the system.
Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. I guess we can start with our first question for you. So we would like to know, how do historical practices of family separation show up in today's family policing or child welfare system?
Oh, well, between the racial disparities, the disproportionality of the surveillance and intervention, the way that they remove our children, citing it as neglect because to them our poverty is an issue.
Can you share a little bit about how you think like the historical practice of slavery shows up in today's child welfare system?
I mean, everything about the family policing system is about money. Um, they use ASFA as a way of targeting families and to keep us from getting our kids back. So if your child is under 8 years old, is the way it's written. They say to us that, you know, if you're out of your child's life for 15 or 22 months, then that gives them grounds when in all actuality, if you're out of your child's life for consecutively 100 days, regardless of them being aware of why you're not there, they fast track the adoption process. And so the adoption process is just like master saying to us, oh, well, we're going to sell them. And they put us on the chopping block and we go to the highest bidder or the person who thinks our kid's the most adorable.
Mm. So how do you see like the most direct connections between the carceral system and the family policing system specifically for Black communities?
Well, um, they're deeply intertwined and mutually reinforcing the same things. I mean, they, if, the color of our skin is one thing. So for anyone who doesn't look like them, we're a problem. We're too educated, or we don't have the knowledge to, think a certain way, or don't let us have mental health issues, or an issue that we don't feel like is a problem, but you feel like it's a problem. You constantly use those things against us as a way to try to punish us for not being like them.
And how do you see poverty and surveillance intersecting in the lives of Black parents?
Well, if we work too much, we're not responsible parents. If we don't work enough, we're not responsible parents. If we take city transportation, we're not fit to be a parent. So it's like we were blessed with being able to have children. During slavery culture, we were the ones who were raising masters' kids, but when we have our own, we're now unfit to do the job.
What do you think are the emotional and generational impacts on families and communities when children are removed?
I mean, it's like ripping the Band-Aid all over again. We had to go through having our families ripped apart, and we got to a point where we felt like we were safe and we were okay to be able to, uh, bridge the gap that was there before, to be able to heal from those traumas, just to have to go through the family policing system or the family policing surveillance to be ripped apart again. And so you have families who, let's say, have 6 kids, and all of the kids are separated. They're not keeping the sibling bonds together. All of these kids are adopted in different areas, and one of the children die. Y'all come together to celebrate this child, but yet y'all are, the kids are looking like, I never knew I had a brother. I never knew I had a sister. They begin to ask questions. Or my favorite thing, you have um, melanated or indigenous children or Hispanic children living with someone who doesn't understand their culture. But you're in a position where you're going to teach me how to be a Black woman when you've never been a Black woman.
Do you think that slavery still impacts Black families today?
Yes, ma'am. Every day.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
From the prison system to the courthouse to your job, it's all there. Because we still have people who feel like we as melanated or POCs don't deserve to have the same pay as them, the same jobs as them. We're, bottom feeders. All we're good to do is give birth to some babies, cook for them, do their laundry, and pick up their trash. We're not supposed to be in the boardroom. We're not supposed to be in these types of situations. We're supposed to be laborers only.
Oh, that's heavy. How have families you work with reclaimed their power and rebuild after system involvement?
A lot of them have had to do some self-inventory to realize that even though they chose the men or the women that they had kids with, or they chose to do drugs or whatever, they acknowledge their fault, and they acknowledge the responsibility that they played in their kids being taken, even if the allegations were true. And they go through the process of getting themselves the therapy, working on themselves, then working on the needs of their children as well as the people that they have around them. Sometimes we just choose poorly. I was one of them.
So
So
how
a
do
lot
you
of times,
think? Oh no, I'm
go ahead.
sorry. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I mean, by acknowledging the problem and finding the solution, whether it's your community. I'm a firm believer it takes a village to raise a child, but I also believe it takes a village to keep a family connected. Everybody doesn't work a normal 9 to 5. Some of us work 7 to 7. Some of us work 7 to 11, or some of us work the graveyard. Everybody's makeup is different.
So how could families that are involved with the system go about finding resources?
Well, social media is a beautiful thing. It's a blessing and a curse. So a lot of organizations are connected with other organizations. So social media, sometimes you can simply put in, programs that are against, family policing, and about 3,600 different places will come up. And most of them are connected to one another. If they're not, then, one or two will stand out. I have, previous free project participants who literally will call me and be like, hey, I got somebody for you, or they'll give them my number. Networking events. I mean, we're everywhere.
Okay, last question for you. How can non-impacted allies and organizations best support Black-led efforts to abolish the family policing system?
Do something. Actually be willing to gravitate whatever smoke that comes. So if that means being a host family for an individual who may not be a part of CPS yet, and say, hey, I got to have, a root canal. I'm going to be, out for like, 9 hours. Being able to say, I'll take, those kids, till, you're feeling better. Or, being able to offer those families who, have an issue with being able to have food to feed their kids, taking them, to and from soup kitchens, or providing them with a meal. There's various ways that it can happen. I mean, you can bring the free project to your community, and I'll personally come and train you how to be, the solution or the resource, that those families need in that community.
Before we end, can you speak a little bit more about the free project?
So FREE stands for Family Reunification, Equity, and Empowerment. Me, myself, I'm very heavy on the equity. I can't work harder for you to get your kids than you're going to work for yourself. We help families navigate the CPS system from whatever stage of their case they're in when they come to us to the end. We also do follow-up, with them. We do one-on-ones as well as port canvassing. We do port support. We show up at IEP meetings, CFT meetings, wherever y'all need us, we're there. We guide them from the beginning to the end of their cases.
And where are you all based?
So we have a current active hubs in Tennessee, Kentucky, Texas, and California. And I am due to train about 7 more in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and New York.
All right. Well, thank you, Shawneequa, for this discussion. Thank you for all the work you do. It was good having a conversation with you.
Thank you.
Okay. So next up we have Zoe. I didn't want to pronounce your last name because I didn't want to mess it up. So I'll give you the opportunity to do that yourself. But can you start off? Well, Zoe will be speaking on the topic of disability in family policing. So can you start off by introducing yourself and describing your relationship to the topic disability and family policing?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm Zoe Jamail, and I previously worked at Disability Rights Tennessee as the policy coordinator. I also worked in the legal department for a little bit. I used to practice law in California. I like to say I'm in recovery from practicing law, but I do really love policy work. And so my future plans are to stay in policy work. And a lot of what I was doing at Disability Rights Tennessee centered around youth in the child welfare and juvenile justice system, youth with disabilities. And what we have found in that space is that a lot of the young people, in fact, almost 80% of the young people who are in the juvenile justice system in Tennessee have had prior contact with the Department of Children's Services on the dependent and neglected side. So one of the things that we've really been focused on is how, to support parents and families earlier on, more upstream, so that young people are not entering these systems, and particularly so that, they're not being policed by, families are not being policed by the Department of Children's Services and other systems like it. So, but yes, that's where my connection to disability and this topic comes from.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Zoe. So our first question for you is, how do systems of family policing disproportionately impact parents and caregivers with disabilities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So this is not a new observation. This is something that has been pretty pervasive since, the inception of family policing systems and even before possibly. But in 2012, the National Council on Disability observed that the child welfare system is ill-equipped to support parents with disabilities and their families, which results in disproportionately high rates of involvement with child welfare services. And devastatingly high rates of parents with disabilities losing their parental rights. That 2012 report asserted that discrimination against parents with disabilities is persistent, systemic, and pervasive. And inequities faced by parents with disabilities in these family policing systems are partially rooted in discriminatory state laws that allow for parental disability as grounds for termination of parental rights. So including Tennessee, there are 42 states plus District of Columbia that include disability within their termination of parental rights laws. And an analysis of national data, I think there's around 19% of children who have been removed. Our parental disability was part of that removal decision. And so we see this disability bias reflected in data collection as well, and in the data-driven tools that family policing systems rely on to make decisions about cases. So as far as data collection goes, disability is one of 12 caregiver risk factors that states can report to the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System, or NCANS. And although disability is not in itself indicative of an immediate or future safety concern that would result in harm to a child, it may be factored into some of the data-driven tools that are being used to make decisions about cases in ways that increase a family's cumulative risk score and can put them, over a certain threshold that leads to removal. So it really does, I think, disability comes into play when we're talking about custody, and also, when we're talking about the termination of parental rights, removal. I can talk a little bit more about that in the next question.
So what patterns do you see in how families with disabled members are treated in comparison to non-disabled families?
Yeah, so parents with disabilities are more likely than their non-disabled counterparts to be involved with family policing system, to have allegations investigated and substantiated, and to have their parental rights terminated. So they're more likely to be reported to the state's to Department of Children's Services just based on disability. These reports result in family separation more often than when there are reports against parents without disabilities. And those reports are often driven by stereotypes or assumptions about a parent's ability rather than on actual wrongdoing or, something that the individualized facts of the circumstances of that family. And then once, authorities receive a report alleging maltreatment, they are again more likely to investigate and substantiate cases against parents with disabilities. So in a recent study, parents with any type of disability had 70% higher odds of substantiation than parents without a disability. And then once, DCS removes a disabled parent's child from the home, the parent faces barriers to reunification that they might not face if they didn't have a disability. So, for example, more frequently we see that long-term foster care rather than reunification is the case goal. We also see that when disabled parents are working toward reunification, they're less likely to receive access to those family preservation and reunification services. And if they do receive those services, they're not usually tailored to the individualized needs of the person, and based on their disability. So I think, those are the main ways that we see disability playing into family policing and some of the patterns that we see as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask, what kind of stereotypes do you think lead to families with disabled members being reported more often?
Yeah, I think there is, an ableism that underlies our family policing system that stereotypes people with disabilities as being unfit to parent just based on the fact that they have a disability. And so, I was going to save this quote for later, but I'll read it now. This is a quote taken directly from a Supreme Court opinion in Buck versus Bell in 1927. And a Supreme Court justice said, "It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." And the justice went on to say, "The welfare of society may be promoted via the sterilization of mental defectives." And please excuse the language. But that is, those are the types of stereotypes underlying intellectual disability and mental illness rising to the level of, incompetence. And so I think those are the types of really harmful stereotypes that, even though people aren't necessarily saying these things out loud anymore, and we've come, a long way from the days of sterilization, arguably termination of parental rights has become a backdoor to sterilization. It has the same effect in some ways in terms of preventing people with disabilities from parenting.
So, do you believe that there are specific types of disabilities that are more often targeted or scrutinized by the child welfare system, like intellectual, physical, mental health related?
Yes. So I think when there are multiple disabilities at play, that's often something that can lead to removal more often than in other situations. But I would say intellectual disability, as well as psychiatric disabilities or mental illness, are the ones that most often lead to family policing and removals and termination of parental rights. So parents with, a national survey revealed that parents with psychiatric disabilities were 8 times more likely to have contact with the family policing system compared to parents without. And that they are 26 times more likely to have a child removed from the home after being reported to an agency. We don't have great data in Tennessee, but there was a study out of Washington that looked at some of their state administrative data, and it found that 22% of mothers with intellectual or developmental disabilities were reported to the family policing system within 1 year of their child's birth, and 36% within 4 years. That's a staggering statistic. And conversely, only 6% of mothers without intellectual disabilities were reported within 1 year of birth, and only 10% within 4 years. So I think that gives a little, a little look into how these stereotypes of individuals with intellectual disability really play into how they are policed. And there was another study based on that INCANS data I was talking about earlier that found that parents with intellectual disability had a 73% higher likelihood of having their case substantiated than a parent with no disability. So again, really seemingly it's just this idea of, oh, well, that person has an intellectual disability or, you know, a mental illness, and they, you know, they're not fit to be parents. So I think one other, that I guess it was with the intellectual disability, that rate was higher than parents with a disability diagnoses of like learning disability, physical disability, or visual hearing impairment and other medical conditions. So only parents with severe mental illness or those with multiple disabilities had higher odds of their cases being substantiated.
So, how do you think that fitness to parent is often inaccurately measured when a parent has a disability?
So, I think one of the, when we're talking about, you know, fitness to parent, so often it is, that is a reflection of the supports and resources that parents have, right? And so because we are already, parents with disabilities are already at this disadvantage in terms of not being connected to the, you know, reunification services and the other resources and supports that they need, I think there's automatically, you know, something like a strike against them in terms of fitness. But I think, again, it is this, these stereotypes that really underlie that determination. And we do have, in Tennessee code, we do have language from a bill that passed in 2021, and it does prevent termination of parental rights based purely on disability, unless it impacts the psychological or mental welfare of the child. So there is some protective language when it comes to that fitness to parent analysis. But I don't know that in practice that statutory language is doing much to benefit parents throughout that investigation or determination.
I'm glad you touched on that, because that was a question that, like, the next question I had, do you think that parental rights are terminated strictly because the family member is disabled?
I do think that that is something that happens in practice. And I think that for some, it might be, you know, I will say there's a brand new rule from Department of Health and Human Services. It passed in 2024, and it really addresses this very issue. And it basically says a state cannot terminate parental rights based on speculation, stereotypes, or generalizations about a parent's disability rather than an individual determination concerning fitness to parent. So based on that, it's possible that we will see a shift in how these determinations are made when parental disability is a factor. Like I said, this is really new language. I don't know if it's been used in Tennessee to, you know, argue any cases at this point. But I think that, and maybe I'm getting a little bit into how we shift narratives about parents with disabilities, but I think pointing to, you know, recent federal language as well as language in our own Tennessee code, there is an argument that, you know, we can't continue to let stereotypes shape the way that family policing impacts these families. And so that's, you know, I think when thinking about how we change the narrative, I think pointing to these more recent developments in our state law and on the federal level is one way to do that.
Yes, I know you just like touched on shifting narratives, but is there anything else you wanted to share about how we can shift public and professional narratives to affirm that disabled parents are capable and deserving of support, not punishment?
Yeah. And I think in addition to that, really looking and emphasizing the importance of supports and services. And maybe even, I think one of the shortcomings of family policing in the context of people with disabilities is that when they're not getting hooked up with the services that they need, it's because the Department of Children's Services doesn't provide those services, right? So a lot of times people with disabilities really need services from the Department of, it's now Department of Disability and Aging, but it used to be the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And then people with mental illness rising to the level of a disability would need services through the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. So I think better coordination between DCS and those departments when, trying to connect people with the services that they need is another way to or something to push for, and to really focus on the fact that with the right supports and resources, just like any other, marginalized group, with the right supports and resources, people with disabilities are capable of parenting, and are fit to parent, and really are not, it's not something that should be a reason for families to no longer be able to be together.
Okay. You're literally reading my mind. I was just going to ask next about resources and support. So if families with disabilities aren't able to receive any resources from the department, are there any other avenues you would suggest they take to receive resources?
Yeah, so I would always encourage people to reach out to Disability Rights Tennessee. That's my former organization, and they do an incredible job of connecting people with resources and supports. And then there are other, depending on, what type of supports are needed, there are many other organizations. The ARC Tennessee is a great one. They do great advocacy. And that's another thing when moving through this process with the Department of Children's Services. I think ensuring that people with disabilities are connected to advocates who have disability experience is really important. And yeah, I think those are some of the best places to start for people. And that's one of the things that I have thought about in terms of termination of parental rights, the fact that, there's no constitutional right to an attorney in those situations. It's different from in the criminal context. And so really, I think that emphasizes the importance of getting people connected to, free advocacy services, which is what DRT provides, and Disability Rights Tennessee and other people like the ARC Tennessee as well. So.
Well, thank you so much, Zoe, for this discussion and for sharing.
Thanks for having me.
So next, we're going to have Ray Holloman, and he is going to speak on LGBTQ plus parents and family policing. So Ray, could you start off by introducing yourself and describing your relationship to the topic LGBTQ plus parents and family policing?
Yeah, so my name is Ray Holloman. My pronouns are he, him, and my relationship is I have one kid, and he is 15 months old. But just even thinking about having a kid, I had to think about my relationship to what it would be to have a kid in this state as a transgender man. And so a lot of that was just getting me to start looking at what are the laws, what are the protections that I need to do, especially since I am a non-biological parent.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Can you start off with speaking on how the child welfare system has historically treated LGBTQ plus parents and how that legacy shows up today?
Yeah, so up until let's say 10 years ago, there wasn't even marriage equality across the land. And so if you're thinking about it from that perspective, a lot of our laws are based upon basically if two people are married, then that child is is legally tied to both of those people. Well, if you cannot get married in the state, then you may not necessarily have the rights. If you divorce, in some states, you may have been possibly lost custody, because if you went from a heterosexual marriage to now saying that you're identifying as a lesbian or some other part of the community, there was a potential that you could have lost your kids through that. If you're transgender, the same thing could have happened, is that they are going to deem you not fit to be a parent because you have a non-heterosexual cisgender identity. And so those really impacts means that a lot of people may have stayed in the closet or did not come out or were very private about it till their kids were of the age of majority, just because they did not want to interact with the system.
So, what do you think are some of the most common assumptions or stereotypes used to justify increased scrutiny of queer and trans families?
I think a lot of it goes back to people saying that children need a mother and a father. Only heterosexual parents can provide a normal environment, whatever that is deemed. I think it's the villainization of the queer community to say that we are going to turn our kids trans or a gay, or turn them into a lesbian just by them being in our households. Just all the assumptions about being promiscuous and all of the things that continue to come up, that the child is going to see increased social stigma if two moms or two dads show up to the playground together, that they're going to be bullied by their peers. I think also thinking about, especially we're seeing right now, transgender people are being deemed as predators, which we've seen before in this community. We've seen that we've been deemed as predators to children. And so that is another reason why. And so I think it's just all of these stereotypes that continue to compound, and that we've tried to, you know, show that, like, hey, we're just like everybody else, but it still continues to come up even in 2025.
I'm glad you touched on that 2025 piece, because I think that was going to be my next question. Like, do you believe that those stereotypes do still exist today? I think, like, before, like, post 2015, some people would have said no, but now we're in 2025, things are a little bit different. So do you think those stereotypes do still exist today?
I think they exist at varying levels. I think that a lot of the attention and heat has been on transgender people, transgender parents, anybody in that community, because as we saw, marriage equality basically kind of became the law of the land. The target shifted to just attacking transgender people themselves. And so we started seeing the increase of all the anti-trans laws. But I mean, we're still seeing that adoption agencies are trying, will not even allow, you can be LGBTQ and not be able to have services. So what does that also relate to? If they're interacting in the system, are they going to get the same level of services as someone that is heterosexual? So we start seeing, like, all of these stereotypes still exist, but they're just a lot quieter about them. And we're not seeing all the publicity because everybody's like, we got marriage equality, but what was that next step? And so I don't think that a lot of people and agencies stopped at that step, because there is a high proportion of people in the LGBT community that do not have kids, or have kids prior to coming into the community. So it can look very differently, but for some people, like when you're trying to do family planning is not even made for the LGBTQ community. Organizations and companies don't even think about it. So it does become that more cumbersome to think about. It's going to cost you X amount to just have a kid, and then all the additional things that a person may have to do just to protect their legal ties to their child.
So how do you think that LGBTQ plus parents experience heightened surveillance from teachers, healthcare providers, or like child welfare agencies?
I think especially in Tennessee, a lot of that is there's a presumption that if you're married, you're going to be a heterosexual couple. So just that scrutiny of, like, if you show up to a parent teacher conference and it's two moms or two dads, there's going to be that extra level. And in some places in the state, that still is not seen as okay. Transgender people, a lot of times, especially if they're in the midst of the transition, they may get misgendered, dead named, and be disrespected by just trying to interact. And so a teacher could just say, go and report, because they are mandatory reporters, to say, hey, I don't think this child is safe because their parent is transitioning. And we've seen how that has been weaponized against trans people just transitioning and being around kids. That is weaponized. And so it's just kind of like makes you wonder, do you want to go see the teacher? Do you go and interact and be, that all involved parent, knowing that you may interact with a mandatory reporter that may report you because they don't like who you are as a person. It's nothing to do with your parenting or anything like that. They just don't like that you're trans or that you're a lesbian. And so that makes it difficult sometimes to want to be as involved as you probably could be, just because you don't know who you may interact with on that other side.
Mhm. So, can you speak a little bit about how LGBTQ plus families are often erased by systems that don't recognize non-biological or non-marital family structures?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that looks like the paperwork that you have to do to ensure those family bonds. That's something that like I had to like I've been married to my partner for 7 years. And so by the state, any child that is born in our marriage would be legally my child. However, I also know that I live in a state that potentially her parents could contest because I have no biological relation to that child. They could come and try to contest that. And so then I had to go and do the additional paperwork of doing a second parent adoption just to make sure, because the birth certificate may not be enough. So I had to do that additional paperwork to ensure that like I have all of my I's crossed and T's dotted. I had to make sure I had all of this together just to ensure. And I have the privilege and experience and education to know that I have to do these things. But there are a lot of people who end up in these situations of like, oh, I'm just going to go have a kid with my partner. We're going to use a sperm donor or however they choose to create their family. But they don't think about all the legalities. Something happens, and then now they're trying to figure out they may not have access to that child anymore because they don't have any biological relation, because a lot of times it comes back to biology. And so having to go through all that. So I think that's a way that people don't necessarily think about, but it really does impact a lot of the LGBTQ families.
Mhm. So before we get into the next question, can you talk a little bit about like the resources or the steps you would advise LGBTQ plus families to take when they are making that decision to start a family?
Yeah, I would say some of the resources is contact a family lawyer. See what you need to do just to make sure that everything is going to be, make sure that you both have your rights. Because obviously you want to bring this child in together and you don't want to think about what may happen in the future, but you never know. And so you want to make sure that you have all of that together. And there's, and knowing that you may need to do a second parent adoption. Do you want to, if you're not married, is that something that you consider? Because that is at least another level to show the level of commitment to the policing system to say, hey, they were married and then they went and got a second. So it makes them know that these were not things that were just done off a whim, and that there was a lot of intentionality that happened. And so it's just really thinking through, because these are difficult decisions and they can be expensive decisions as well. Nobody wants to, spend that money. And so that's stuff that you already have to plan for, especially if you're using like IUI or IVF. It's already an expensive process. And so you're trying to think about how can you cut costs. But I think legality and making sure that you have the rights to that child is not one thing that you want to cut your costs on.
Thank you so much for sharing that advice and resources. So, how can LGBTQ plus organizers be in solidarity with abolitionist family justice movements and vice versa?
I think that we all have to understand, and I really like that we're centering this in intersectionality, that there are going to be LGBTQ parents and they have some of the same struggles that we see in the family justice movement, and they are going to collide together. And so, how can we make sure that we're not just thinking about, the heterosexual couples, but how are we thinking about the LGBT couples and how things may look differently? I think it's very similar to thinking about people with disabilities, how that's going to look different than just your, cisgender heterosexual couple that maybe has no disabilities at all. And so understanding that they've been trying to take kids away for years and all different various facets. And so we have to kind of work together to basically kind of deconstruct the structures that are there to make sure that we all can raise our kids in the ways that we want to raise our kids without threat of them being taken away because we have a non-normative identity.
Well, our final question, what forms of mutual aid or peer support have you seen emerge among LGBTQ plus parents facing family policing, and how can we grow those models?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is there's a lot of community groups, a lot of like local neighborhood and like regional groups that are just like trying to share what they're doing. That's where you can get a lot of these ideas from. Maybe they have a recommendation of a lawyer that you can use that understands how to do this stuff. Or maybe if you do get a case, they can relate you to somebody else that's also gone through this. And so I think it's really being in community with each other, whether that be virtually or in person, because I think that's how we share that type of knowledge. That's how I learned a lot of this stuff was just
Mhm.
being in community and starting to ask questions because I did have a lot of concerns of being the non-biological parent. What do I need to do to protect my rights if something was to happen, and knowing that I may have hostile family members on the outside that maybe want to come in say that I'm not worthy enough or I have this non-normative identity and so they don't think that I should be able to raise the child. So I think it's really knowing that, knowing your rights that you have, and then just asking for help. Like if something is confusing or you don't understand, reaching out to the networks or to organizations to be like, hey, I'm concerned about this. Have you had some experience with this before? And can you help me kind of figure out how do we navigate through this?
So, are there any specific groups or organizations that you feel provide mutual aid or peer support that LGBTQ plus parents or families might want to check out?
I would just say Google in your area, like a queer parents group, because I think that's going to be the best way to kind of get localized resources. There isn't really a lot. There's a lot about how you can become a parent. So there's a lot involved of like, all of those forms and facets, but a lot of like when it starts getting into the legality and a lot of that stuff, a lot of people just don't know and they think, oh, my marriage license is enough. I don't need anything else because the state will have this presumption. It's like, no, you have to take this additional step. And so some of this is just making the awareness to LGBTQ parents because usually one is going to be a non biological parent, that there may be some additional steps that you need to take.
Mhm. Well, Ray, thank you so much for this discussion and for sharing. So I think we're going to take a second for a little Q&A section. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm going to give them a second to drop those.
I have one question just to get things started, and thank you so much to all of you all for sharing your experience and just also putting your experience within like this larger like context. It's was just helpful for me to listen and just make some connections in my mind. And one of the things I've been thinking about, and this has been happening like for a minute now, like attacks on trans kids and support Supreme Court rulings that came um, down recently. So my question, I mean, I guess it's open, but I'm thinking about you, Ray. You talked a lot from like the angle of parents, but I like and trying to start families. But I am curious when it comes to parents who are trying to support their children and receiving gender affirming care and like other resources and supports, how that can put them in contact um with the child welfare family policing system, and again like what we see like being passed like legislation not only in Tennessee but across the country, and how the Supreme Court is upholding that. Just wanted to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, it's kind of devastating in some ways that now the Supreme Court has said that parents cannot support the healthcare of their own child. And so they have taken that away from them of being able to say, yes, I understand all these things, I understand the implications, but for my child, this is the best thing to do. And now, as a state, we have stripped that away from the parents. And so now they have to decide, how do they support their child? What do they do? What state can they go to? If they do go to another state to access this type of care, are they going to now interact with the family policing system here in our state because it's seen as child abuse? Because and so it just makes all of these larger things. And I know that some states across the country have deemed it like, if you support your trans child, it can be deemed as child abuse and you can start interacting with that system. And so it's, as somebody who obviously advocates for the trans community, it's like our hands become tied very quickly because it's like we want to support the trans youth. We want to get them the access to the healthcare that they need, but also knowing that that could mean that they start now interacting with the system that wants to actively harm them as well. And so it's like it's this big push pull, and even seeing that, you know, with one of the executive orders came out that like we were telling a lot of trans youth like, okay, just wait to 18, just wait to 18 and you know you'll be an adult. And then they kick the age to 19. So what's not to say they're going to come and kick the age to 21 or 25 or to something else, because we've always treated the bar as 18. And so it's also trying to, there's a lot of organizations that are trying to figure out how do we support the youth and making sure that, hey, they're still going to be around tomorrow, and know that like, hey, we're here fighting for them, while institutions are actively harming the community, um, as we speak, and you know, getting rid of a lot of the LGBTQ programming, providing the healthcare services, the navigation services, that we need here in the state. And so it's kind of this really hard thing. And so it's like you really have to think about, you know, is this going to be, do you have a support system enough that will help protect you in this type of situation? And so you don't have that fear, but a lot of people know that there is a risk that they're going to come up into the family policing system if they just accept their child for who they are.
If I could add one thing to that, just because you jogged my memory, Ray, about a discussion I was having with a member of the legislature here. And I think some of the, framing and narratives that we have used in the youth justice space has been related to brain science and how young people up until a certain age, their brains aren't fully developed and all of this. And we have since moved away from that because I think it can be really harmful in the context of young people who are transgender and trying to get gender affirming care, because that argument was turned right around on me. We were not talking about this issue. We were talking about mandatory transfer of youth to the adult criminal justice system for certain offenses. And I was, talking a little bit about this brain science idea, and it very quickly turned into, well, wouldn't you also argue that, young kids who want gender affirming care should receive it? And how do you reconcile those two things? And so I think as advocates, generally, we always have to be aware of how our framing and our narratives impact other advocacy efforts. And so we have since moved away from that, brain science argument, because it was, I think, doing harm in other areas.
I think we're going to give it one more second to see if we have any more questions. All right, so I think we have no questions. So before we end, I do want to plug some upcoming things that Healthy and Free has coming up. Uh, First and foremost, our next webinars for our July in Bloom political education series. So next week, Tuesday, July 1st at 11:30 a.m. Central Time, we'll have the next webinar, which would be Repro Health and Environmental Justice with Young, Gifted, and Green. So that'll be live here on Instagram. And then Thursday, July 17th at 1 p.m. Central Time, we'll be having the webinar Supporting Caregivers with Tennessee Caregivers Coalition. So you can also find our previous conversations on the Healthy and Free YouTube channel at Healthy Free TN. And then related to the Poverty is Not Neglect campaign, this month we will be putting out our Know Your Rights guide and our Know Your Rights training. So be on the lookout for that. And then on Tuesday, July 29th at 12:30 p.m., Healthy and Free will be speaking on the Movement for Family Power panel to discuss the problem with child abuse pediatricians. So that's some things that we have coming up. I want to thank all of our speakers, Zoe, Shawneequa, and Ray, so much for engaging in this conversation and speaking on these important topics.
Thank you for having us.
Of course.
It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.